Hello, everyone. So I did coaching on today's group call around our cortisol and our stress response, specifically reviewing the two very distinct cases when looking at the Dutch Plus and what when we have these type of patterns, what we need to do in order to really make sure that we're working on that gut brain axis and our stress management. But in both of these cases, they're pretty different from one another, and so I wanted to just break this down so we could really start to understand this cortisol awakening response. It plays a massive role in a lot of different processes, biological processes within the body. So let's just dive right in. So this first case, as you can see here, it has a very flat cortisol awakening response. So if you recall with the Dutch Plus, we take a point at when we wake. This is the saliva test. 30 minutes after waking, 60 minutes after waking. And what we expect to see is a spike here. Okay, so cortisol is what allows us to wake up, to get ourselves out of bed, to get going for the day. And then what we would expect to see is that it tapers as the day goes to prepare us for rest. Now, in this specific situation, we have a very flat cortisol awakening response. And so this is a sign that this client has decreased stress resilience. So they are going to really start to struggle in stressful situations where the body is not actually responding in the same way that it should. So what this tells me is that this is someone that has been involved with a chronic stress situation, long-term stress that really has now impacted. So it's very similar to a type 2 diabetic that has eaten a very high sugar diet, and now their insulin has become resistant or less sensitive. Same case. So we have that HPA axis, hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal. And when we perceive that stressful situation, eventually over and over and over and over again, eventually the adrenals will say, wait a second, I just released some cortisol, so now I'm not going to release any. So as you can see here, what we're looking at in this this report is on the very first page toward the top of your lab report. And so this is going to be the free cortisol that's actually within the body and that is able to work in an active form. This is only representative of about 1 to 3% of the cortisol within our body. And as you can see here, she has a very, very low amount. Now, this is actually metabolized cortisol. And so I always like to see that what this pattern looks like, because in this specific case, her cortisol is being metabolized quicker than it's being made. And so again, probably contributing to some of her fatigue that she may feel. Cortisol affects our blood pressure. It's really, this patient is probably having a really hard time getting up and getting moving first thing in the morning. And then as you can see here, even though the spike is small, she does still have a spike of this cortisol release. And considering that she's had very low cortisol most of the day, this little bit of a spike may be hindering her sleep at night as well. Okay, and so let's talk about this cortisol awakening response. This is actually someone that does have autoimmunity, and one of the big things that this cortisol awakening response is responsible for is a filtering system. So we have a backup system. When we have cells in our body, immune cells or whatever type of cell that is that has mutated, So in the case of autoimmunity, now we have a situation where our immune cells are now battling, whether it's our joints or our thyroid or whatever your autoimmune condition is. We're not getting that filtering system. So what the body will do is it'll recognize this cell is not functioning the way that it needs to. I'm going to tag it to notify the immune system to come in and to prepare it for apoptosis or cell death. And in this specific case, this is not happening. So we really need to focus on getting this cortisol awakening response functioning the way that it needs to get that peak. This will require a little support from supplementation standpoint. Along with, stress management strategies, meditation, upregulation of the vagus nerve that controls the parasympathetic nervous system, to begin to work on better strategies when managing stress. Now, when I see this and I recognize that this is a chronic stress situation, then we have to still go a little more upstream. And now we have to actually look at behaviors and specific personality types, interpersonal relationships. So who are you surrounding yourself with? Are you constantly coming up against stress every single day? Maybe they're in a very stressed work environment. And we need to start to work on some strategies there in terms of mindset, in terms of recognizing, maybe boundary setting is going to be really important for them, to be able to say no in certain situations because they need to start to prioritize their health and not keeping their calendar so jam-packed that they constantly feel like they're in this frantic state. Okay, and then here this is actually page 6 or 7, but you can see stress, and we're now looking at that HPA axis that I often talk about. So this is the hypothalamus, the pituitary and adrenal glands. Now, when we perceive stress comes in via the amygdala, is the organ that's responsible for perceiving stress. It's what activates the hypothalamus and creates this hormonal cascade that occurs. Okay, and so a lot of people use the term adrenal fatigue, and there's a lot of controversy around this type of diagnoses in the medical community, because really at the end of the day, if you're talking, there's adrenal insufficiency, and that's more of an Addison's situation where the adrenals have stopped producing adequate amounts of hormones. But here, as you can see, the adrenals are responsible for releasing both cortisol as well as DHEA. And in this case, her cortisol levels, although they are low, her DHEA is well within a normal range given her age. And so this really, to me, is more of a stress resilience situation. And so I always like to point that out. Now, it is also going to look at your waking melatonin. And the reason that it draws a waking melatonin, that seems kind of counterintuitive. We need melatonin when we're sleeping. But this, again, is drawn from the urine first thing in the morning. And so this will be a byproduct of the melatonin. And it'll give us a good idea of how much melatonin you actually have at night while sleeping. And so, melatonin, again, going back to apoptosis and cell death, melatonin is responsible for triggering that process while we are sleeping. So it is very important. Melatonin is very important, not only for the appropriate circadian rhythm and cycle of cortisol, but also for triggering that apoptosis when we do have cells that have gone bad. Sorry about that. Not sure what just happened. Okay, so now let's move on to our second situation. And in this in this situation, as you can see here, this is an exaggerated cortisol awakening response. So although it starts at a very normal level, it really spikes pretty drastically within that first 30 minutes. And then it stays very high throughout most of the day. And so what this tells me in terms of looking at that gut-brain axis and the HPA axis is that we have a very hypervigilant stress response in this client. So this means that even with average stress, it's really going to activate her HPA axis significantly more than on average. So because we can't live in a bubble, it is important, you know, that we do get this under control. So this is someone that would really benefit from weaving in, you know, whether it's 5-minute breathing breaks, whatever they can for stress management throughout the day. Vagus nerve activation is going to be really important. And so that's where, when it comes from meditation or breath work, by slowing the breath down, we're going to activate the vagus nerve. That's going to upregulate that parasympathetic nervous system and downregulate the sympathetic. And it will help with this HPA axis response. So things like that will be very important. Other, you know, stress management strategies that we know of are getting out in green space. If you don't have any time to, or maybe you're not in an environment that's conducive for meditation, and you're struggling with that, then even just watching like a funny viral video and laughing will decrease the stress response. So it will help to get her back into a more homeostatic state. But as you can see, when we're looking at that free cortisol, again, very, very high here. Now, when we look at the metabolized cortisol, it's being metabolized a little bit slower than it's being produced. And so for someone that's already very hypervigilant, this can really make them feel the effects of that cortisol response. So that, you know, heart palpitations, shortness of breath, maybe clammy skin, it's going to really create that increased perception of stress. My goodness, that's being so sensitive. Okay, and again, just looking at that HPA axis, we see that melatonin is normal in this case. Her DHEA is high as well, so her adrenals are just working so incredibly hard from this constant flow and activation of the HPA axis. So as I mentioned, really working on stress management strategies with this client, maybe even helping her support her cortisol levels throughout the day. This would be very helpful. And then here, this is an inactive form of cortisol, so it's the metabolites versus all the cortisol within the body. And so as you can see, we're pretty neutral there. So there's no major discrepancy between the active versus the inactive forms. So if we have any further questions about any of that, I highly encourage each of you to go through and check out your Dutch Plus and kind of go through this. If you need specific strategies over your cortisol levels and what your stress response looks like, this is something that we usually always cover as in our lab review specifically for you. But if you have any other questions after watching this video, I'm more than happy to cover those with you. Right. Have a great day.